A cold knock came on Elara's door so softly that at first she thought it was only the wind shifting the rain against the wood. The night had been quiet in the way poor nights often were. No music, no visitors, no reason for anyone to be out on the road. Elara had finished washing her last cup and was waiting for the kettle to warm again, more for the comfort of the habit than for thirst. Outside, the world was a blur of wet fields and low clouds. Inside, the small house held its usual, dependable things. A clean table, a basket of mended cloth, bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, and the little fire that kept the chill from settling into her bones. When the knock came again, gentle and careful, Elara froze with the dish towel in her hands. In her village, people didn't knock like that unless they were trying not to frighten someone, or unless they were frightened themselves. She crossed the room, not quickly, but with the steady caution of a woman who had learned that panic never helped. She lifted the latch and opened the door a narrow crack. A man stood on her threshold, hunched slightly as if apologizing for taking up space. Rain clung to his dark hair and coat. His face was pale in the lantern light, too pale for someone traveling in winter, and there was dried blood at his collar. Not the dramatic kind that movies might imagine, but a real, human mess, clotted, imperfect, and old enough to tell her he'd been walking hurt for a while. His eyes found hers, and what she saw there wasn't threat. It was exhaustion, and something quieter like shame. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was rough, the way voices get when a person has swallowed pain all day. "I saw your lamp. I don't have anywhere else." Elara's first instinct was to look past him, into the road, to see if he was followed. She saw only darkness and rain. Her second instinct was to count what she had: one spare blanket, half a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, dried herbs. The kind of supplies that mattered to a person like her. And then her third instinct arrived, the one she trusted most. It was not a thought so much as an old truth. A door is a line people draw to keep their lives safe, but sometimes it becomes the line that decides what kind of person you are. "You're hurt," she said. He nodded once. The movement seemed to cost him. Elara opened the door wider. "Come in before you fall," she said, and stepped back to make room, expecting at any moment to feel regret. He crossed the threshold with care, as if the house might reject him. When the warm air touched him, he flinched like someone not used to comfort. Elara saw his shoulders loosen a fraction anyway, as if his body had been waiting for permission to stop bracing. She bolted the door and turned him toward the hearth. "Sit," she instructed, not unkindly. "Let me look at you." He lowered himself into the chair, keeping his injured side protected. In the firelight, she could see the tear in his coat, the stiff way he held his ribs, the bruising beneath the skin near his collarbone. He didn't smell like ale or smoke or horses the way travelers often did. He smelled faintly of rain on stone and something else she couldn't name, something cold. Elara fetched a bowl and warmed water, then found clean cloth. She moved around him the way she'd moved around sick neighbors before, practical and gentle. In a small village, you learned to treat wounds because there wasn't always anyone else. He watched her hands, not in a hungry way, not even in a grateful way at first, more like he was trying to remember what it meant to be touched without harm. "Tell me your name," Elara said, as she carefully loosened his coat. He hesitated. "Kale," he said at last. The name sounded chosen in a hurry. Elara didn't argue. People on roads had reasons. "I'm Elara," she said. "This might sting." She dabbed the wound and found what she expected. A deep gash along his side, already partly sealed, but angry and inflamed. The bleeding had slowed, yet the healing looked odd, too fast in places, too slow in others. Like a body that didn't follow ordinary rules, or like someone who had forced himself to keep walking beyond what was safe. "You need rest," she said. Kale gave a small, humorless breath. "Rest is difficult." Elara set the cloth down and studied him. "Are you feverish?" "No," he said, but the answer came too quickly, too controlled. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead anyway. Cold. Not winter cold from the road, but a deeper cold, as if his skin didn't know how to hold warmth. Elara pulled her hand back, not in fear, yet, but in sudden attention. "You're not from around here," she said quietly. "No." "Are you running from something?" Kale's eyes shifted to the door, then back to her. "Yes." Elara's heart tightened. She should have asked more questions before opening the door. She should have protected herself. But the truth was already in her house, sitting by her fire, bleeding on her chair. "What kind of trouble?" she asked. Kale's jaw worked. "The kind that doesn't forgive." Elara didn't press further. In her experience, people who were hunted didn't confess the details easily, and sometimes it was safer not to know. Yet she couldn't ignore the coldness of his skin, the way he didn't seem to breathe unless he reminded himself, the way the shadows around him felt slightly heavier than they should. She wrapped the wound, tight enough to help, not tight enough to punish. Then she stood and moved to the stove. "I'll make soup," she said, because feeding people was what she did when she didn't know what else to do with her worry. Kale's voice came softly behind her. "You shouldn't." Elara glanced back. "Shouldn't make soup." "You shouldn't keep me here," he said. His eyes were honest in a way that made her uneasy. "It will bring danger to you." Elara lifted her chin, not stubbornly, but steadily. "If danger was the only reason to close a door," she said, "none of us would ever open them. Drink some water, try to sleep. You can leave at dawn if you still want to." Kale looked like he might argue, then stopped. He leaned back and closed his eyes as if obeying was easier than fighting the kindness. Elara poured water into a cup and set it near him. She waited for him to lift it. He didn't. His hand hovered above the cup, fingers trembling slightly. His gaze fixed on the clear surface like it was something complicated. "You don't drink?" she asked. Kale swallowed. "Not much." Elara watched him for another moment. Then she stepped away, letting him keep his dignity. Still, her mind moved through possibilities: illness, shock, strange magic. The old stories her grandmother used to tell when the wind rattled the shutters. Vampires, those stories said, were monsters that came with the night. But the man in her chair didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone who had been forced to become something he never wanted to be. Elara worked quietly. She cooked with what she had, and as the soup warmed, she listened to the house. The fire's soft crackle, the rain's patient tapping, and beneath it all, Kale's stillness. A person breathing in a room had a rhythm. His rhythm was different, not absent, just wrong enough to make her skin prickle. When she brought the bowl to him, he opened his eyes. He stared at the steam as if trying to remember hunger. "I'm not very hungry," he said. "Try," Elara replied, and put the spoon in his hand. Kale lifted the spoon, then paused. His hand shook. The smell of food seemed to confuse him. He forced himself to swallow one mouthful and flinched slightly, as if the warmth hurt going down. Elara sat across from him, folding her hands. "Kale," she said gently, "what are you?" The question landed without anger. Elara wasn't accusing him. She was asking the way she asked the weather what it planned to do. Kale looked down at the bowl. "I'm not safe," he whispered. "That's not an answer." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked older than he had a moment ago, not older in years, but older in sorrow. "If I tell you," he said, "you may hate me." Elara held his gaze. "I might," she admitted, "or I might understand, but I can't choose if I don't know." Kale's throat moved. "I'm not human," he said, voice barely audible. Elara felt the room shift around that sentence. Her stomach tightened, but her hands did not tremble. She had expected this. The cold skin, the strange breathing, the way food didn't call to him. What does that mean? She asked. Kale's lips parted, then closed. Finally, he said, It means I should not have knocked. Elara's eyes stung for reasons she couldn't explain. Not pity exactly. Something more complicated. The ache of seeing someone carry shame like a second spine. You knocked anyway, she said, and I opened, so we're here. Kale's gaze fell to the bandage on his side, as if even her careful work was hard to accept. I'm being hunted, he said, by my own. Elara leaned forward slightly. Why? Kale's voice was quiet. Because I refused. Refused what? Elara wanted to ask. But the way he said it told her enough. He had refused to do something cruel. Who hunts you? She asked. Kale hesitated. The king, he said, then added like it was a confession. The vampire king. Elara's breath caught. That name had lived in every warning parents gave their children. The vampire king ruled from a castle beyond the Black Woods, people said. He did not cross into villages unless he wanted something. He did not ask. Elara looked at Kale more closely. If he belonged to that world, it explained the coldness and the fear that seemed carved into him. And why would the vampire king hunt you? Elara asked, voice steady even as her pulse ran faster. Kale stared into the fire. Because his rule depends on obedience, he said, and I broke it. Elara let silence sit between them. She thought of her village. Thin harvests, taxes that arrived like storms, the way people bowed their heads to survive. She thought of kings, human and otherwise, who never had to feel the consequences of their demands. You can stay here tonight, she said at last. But tomorrow we need a plan. If they find you here, they'll hurt the village. I won't have that. Kale's eyes flicked to her. Why are you helping me? Elara answered honestly. Because you were bleeding. Because you knocked like you didn't want to frighten me. Because I'm tired of living in a world where kindness is treated like stupidity. Kale's face tightened, and for a moment Elara thought he might cry, but he only nodded once, like someone receiving a gift he didn't deserve. That night Elara gave him the small back room. She slept lightly by the hearth, with her shawl pulled tight and a kitchen knife close, not because she intended to use it, but because fear, once invited in, always wanted to stay. Still, she listened to the house and heard no threat from Kale. Only the restless shifting of someone trapped in a body he didn't understand. Before dawn, Elara woke to the sound of another knock. Not loud, not demanding, but certain. She sat up, heart pounding, and stared at the door. The house felt colder, as if the air itself had stiffened. The knock came again. Elara rose and moved to the latch, every part of her screaming to pretend she wasn't home. But the village had taught her something else too. Avoiding the truth didn't keep it away. It only made it arrive when you were less prepared. She opened the door. A man stood under her lantern. He was tall, dressed simply in a dark cloak, but the simplicity looked deliberate, like a person who didn't need to prove anything. His face was calm, almost gentle. His eyes were too still, too old. He looked at Elara like he could see the weight of her worries, and was not interested in using them against her. Good morning, he said quietly. Elara's throat went dry. Who are you? She asked. The man paused, as if deciding how much truth to place in a small home. They call me the Vampire King, he said. My name is Draven. Elara's hand tightened on the door. The world she knew, soup, herbs, mending cloth, felt suddenly fragile. Yet Draven stood there without guards, without a raised voice, without the arrogance she had imagined. I've come because of a report, Draven continued, voice low. A wounded vampire has been sheltered here. You didn't know what he was. Elara could have lied. She could have said no. But something in Draven's face made lying feel pointless. He didn't look like a man searching for an excuse to punish. He looked like a man searching for the edge of a decision. Yes, Elara said. He's here, he's hurt. Draven nodded once, as if he'd expected her honesty. "May I come in?" he asked. The question startled her more than his name. Kings did not ask. Elara hesitated. Behind her in the back room, Kale, no, the vampire, slept. If Draven stepped inside, everything could change in a single breath. But Elara remembered the way Kale had knocked, the way he'd warned her, the way he'd forced down soup like it was a burden. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Draven entered, and the air seemed to shift around him. Not violently, just inevitably. Elara bolted the door on instinct, then regretted it. If Draven wanted to harm her, a bolt wouldn't matter. Draven looked around as if taking in the house with respect. His gaze lingered on the hanging herbs, the worn rug, the kettle, the details of a small life. "You live alone," he said. Elara frowned. "Yes, does that matter?" Draven's eyes softened for a moment. "Only because it means you carry your own burdens. People who carry their own burdens often recognize them in others." Elara didn't know what to do with that. "Why are you here?" she asked bluntly. "If you are Draven, the vampire king, why come yourself?" Draven took a slow breath. He looked tired, though not in the way travelers were tired. He looked like someone who had been tired for centuries. "Because this situation is my fault," he said. Elara stared. "I don't understand." Draven's gaze shifted toward the back room door. "The wounded vampire you sheltered," he said, "was once loyal to me. He fled after refusing an order I gave. I called him traitor." Elara's mouth tightened. "What order?" Draven's eyes flickered, regret passing through like a shadow. "I ordered him to take supplies from a border village that could not afford to lose them," he said. "To enforce obedience, to make a lesson out of hunger." Elara felt something hot rise in her chest, anger sharp enough to taste. "And he refused," she said. "Yes," Draven answered. No defense, no justification, just the truth. Elara crossed her arms. "So you sent hunters?" "I did," Draven said, and the words sounded like stones. "Not because I needed to, but because I was afraid of what his refusal revealed about me." Elara heard it then, beneath the king's calm voice. The conflict that had brought him here. Not a desire for revenge, but a war inside himself. "You came to finish it," Elara said quietly. Draven shook his head once. "I came to decide if I have the courage to end it differently." For a long moment, the house was still. The fire's coals glowed. Rainwater dripped from Draven's cloak onto Elara's floor, leaving dark spots that looked like small wounds. Elara swallowed. "He's sleeping," she said. "He's not a danger to me. If you came here to hurt him, you'll have to hurt me too." Draven looked at her, not with surprise, but with something like sorrow. "I believe you would stand between us," he said. "That's why I came alone." Elara didn't move. "Then what do you want?" Draven's voice lowered. "I want to see him," he said, "and I want to understand why your door opened when so many would have stayed shut." Elara's hands trembled now, but she steadied them against her skirt. She moved to the back room and opened the door carefully. Kale stirred at the sound. He sat up too quickly, then winced, hand going to his side. His eyes fixed on Draven at once, and fear tightened his face. "Your Majesty," Kale rasped. Elara glanced between them. The way Kale spoke the title made her stomach turn. Not because it was wrong, but because it carried history, years of submission and disappointment. Draven stayed at the threshold. He didn't enter the room. He didn't loom. "You're hurt," Draven said. Kale gave a bitter exhale. "That matters now." Draven's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something that looked like pain. "It should have mattered before," he said quietly. Kale's eyes widened slightly, as if the words were so unfamiliar they didn't fit. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle the wound. "Kale," she said softly, Tell him the truth. If he's here, it's better he hears it from you. Kale looked at Elara with a conflicted expression, as if her kindness had become something he didn't know how to carry. Then he looked back at Draven. I refused because it was wrong, Kale said. You asked me to starve people for your control. You asked me to become your cruelty so you could keep your hands clean. Elara's breath caught. Kale's words were not dramatic. They were plain. That made them worse. Draven closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they looked brighter, like grief polished into clarity. You're right, Draven said. I did that. Kale stared. Are you here to kill me? Elara's body tensed. Draven shook his head. No, he said. I'm here because I can feel what I've become and I can't endure it anymore. Kale's lips parted, then closed. He didn't know how to respond to a king admitting weakness. Elara watched Draven carefully. If you won't kill him, she said, then what? You take him back, you make him kneel, you lock him away. Draven's gaze shifted to her. In that moment, Elara understood something terrifying. Draven was not wrestling with whether Kale deserved mercy. He was wrestling with whether he himself deserved to give it. My court expects punishment, Draven said. They expect me to rule through fear. If I allow defiance without consequence, they will call it a crack in the throne. Elara's voice was sharp. And do you care more about your throne than about what's right? Draven flinched, but not away from her, into the truth. I have cared more, he admitted, for a long time. Kale's eyes filled with something like disgust. Then nothing changes. Draven's voice softened. It can, he said, but it will cost me. Elara studied him. What kind of cost? Draven looked toward the small window where the sky was turning gray. If I declare you forgiven, he told Kale, my nobles will say I have grown sentimental. They will test me. They will push harder at the border villages to see if I'll react with old cruelty. If I lie and say you're dead, they will stop hunting you, but the lie will rot inside my rule. Lies always do. Kale's expression tightened. So you came to speak about your discomfort, he said, bitter, not to do anything. Draven's eyes held his. I came to choose, he said, and choices are actions when they're paid for. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Elara stood. She moved to Draven and stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to still be safe if safety mattered. Listen, she said, voice low. You are the vampire king, Draven. You have power I can't imagine, but power without conscience is just a larger way to be small. Draven blinked slowly. Elara continued. If you want redemption, don't make it about whether you feel guilty. Make it about what you will change. Start with him, then start with the villages. And don't ask anyone to praise you for finally doing what should have been done. Kale looked at Elara, like he couldn't believe she was speaking to Draven that way. Draven, however, looked at her like she'd handed him a map through darkness. You're right, he said. No praise, just change. He turned back to Kale. You will not return to my court as a prisoner, Draven said, and you will not be hunted. I will recall the hunters today. Kale's jaw trembled. You can't just... I can, Draven replied. I am the king. If my rule cannot survive one act of mercy, then it deserves to collapse. Elara's chest tightened at the simplicity of it. She had heard leaders speak in circles her entire life, using complexity to hide cowardice. Draven's words were plain. That was how she knew he meant them. Kale's eyes narrowed. And the villages, he asked, voice rough. The ones you bled for obedience. Draven's gaze lowered. I will send grain from my stores, he said. Not as charity, as repayment. I will reduce their taxes for the next season. And I will ban forced seizure without direct royal review. Kale looked stunned. Why? He whispered. Why now? Draven's voice turned quieter. Because I remember what it was to be helpless, he said. And because I met someone who treated helplessness as a reason to open a door, not close it. Elara swallowed hard. The words shouldn't have moved her. But they did, because she realized Draven wasn't talking about Kale alone. He was talking about himself. Draven stepped back from the threshold. "Elara," he said, "your village will see my messengers. They will assume you made a bargain. They will fear you invited danger to their doorstep. That fear will poison your life here." Elara stiffened. She hadn't thought that far. In villages, rumors traveled faster than truth. Safety was a shared agreement, and anyone who disrupted it could be punished, even if they meant well. Draven continued, "I can take that fear onto myself. I can be seen here. I can speak to your village headman. I can make it clear that you acted with mercy, not treason." Elara stared at him. "You would let them blame you." Draven's mouth tightened. "They already do," he said softly. "They simply blame the version of me that I encouraged them to imagine. It's time they meet the version of me that chooses restraint." Kale let out a shaky breath. "You can't rewrite centuries in one morning," he said. "No," Draven agreed, "but I can start." And then he did something Elara didn't expect at all. Draven bowed his head slightly to her, not theatrically, not as performance, as acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me what a door is for." When Draven left the house, he did not vanish into mist or summon a storm. He walked down Elara's muddy path, cloak damp, shoulders straight with purpose that looked almost human. Elara watched from the doorway until he disappeared into the gray. Only then did she realize her hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the strange weight of being witnessed. Her small act of mercy had reached a king and forced him to face himself. Behind her, Kale lay back down, breathing carefully. "You should hate him," Kale murmured, voice faint. "Everyone does." Elara closed the door and leaned against it. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "I hate what he did, but I saw something in his eyes, like someone who's been living in a cage he built and finally noticed the bars." Kale turned his face toward the wall. "Cages don't open themselves," he whispered. Elara looked at the fire. "No," she said, "but sometimes someone chooses to stop locking them." The village woke slowly. There were questions, as Elara knew there would be. A neighbor saw Draven's footprints in the mud and came running with panic in her voice. Men gathered near the well, speaking in urgent bursts. The village headman, an older man named Bram who had spent his life balancing survival and pride, came to Elara's door with two others behind him, faces hard with fear. Elara stepped outside before anyone could accuse her inside her own home. She kept her voice calm. "Yes," she told them before Bram even spoke. "A wounded man came to my door. I let him in, and Draven, the vampire king, came this morning." The men stiffened at the name. Bram's eyes narrowed. Why would he come here? Elara felt the knife edge of the moment. If she sounded defensive, they'd distrust her more. If she sounded proud, they'd fear her. She spoke simply. "Because the wounded man is being hunted," she said, "and because I believe Draven came to stop it." A murmur rose. Someone spat into the mud. Bram's voice was low. "You believe the vampire king came to stop anything other than his own inconvenience." Elara held Bram's gaze. "I believe he came because he was ashamed," she said, "and because he decided shame shouldn't be the end of the story." They stared at her like she was naive. Elara didn't blame them. When you live under pressure long enough, hope starts to feel like a trick. Before Bram could answer, a messenger arrived, on horseback, cloaked against the damp, bearing a black seal. Villagers stepped back as if the seal carried disease. The messenger dismounted, approached Bram, and offered the letter with both hands. "By order of Draven," he said, voice formal, vampire king of the northern court. Bram took it with fingers that trembled despite his efforts. Elara watched him break the seal. watched his eyes move across the page, watched the color drain from his face, then return in a slow, disbelieving flush. "What does it say?" someone demanded. Bram swallowed hard. "It says," he read, stumbling slightly, "all hunters are recalled. The search is ended. No further disturbance will be made in these lands." Silence fell. Bram read further, voice quieter, as if afraid the words would vanish if he spoke them too loudly. "Tax for the border villages is reduced for 1 full season. Grain will be delivered from royal stores as repayment for past seizure. Any future seizure without direct royal review is forbidden." A woman covered her mouth. A man stared at Bram as if he were lying. Elara felt her eyes burn, not because the words fixed everything. They didn't. 1 season of reduced tax didn't erase years of fear. 1 delivery of grain didn't bring back people who had left or died or broken under hunger. But it was a beginning, a public beginning. And beginnings mattered because they changed what people could imagine. Bram looked up slowly. His eyes found Elara, and in them was something like bewildered respect. "What did you do?" he asked her. Elara shook her head. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I opened a door, that's all." Bram's expression tightened, and for a moment Elara saw how hard it was for him to accept kindness from a king. "Doors," he said roughly, "are dangerous." Elara nodded. "Yes," she said, "but so is living your whole life behind one." That afternoon, another messenger came. Then another. Each carrying small, practical changes, a written apology for the seizure orders, a promise of direct lines of complaint to Draven's stewards, protection from roaming patrols. It wasn't a transformation into a fairytale kingdom. It was something more believable and more difficult, a slow turning of a massive wheel, one that had ground people down for generations. Elara's neighbors didn't suddenly trust Draven. They watched the road with narrowed eyes. They counted sacks of grain. They whispered. They waited for the trick. Elara waited too, not for a trick, but for proof that the king's choice would survive pressure. And pressure came quickly. Draven returned to his castle before nightfall. In the high halls, his court gathered like a storm held inside stone walls. Nobles in dark attire, advisors with careful eyes, captains who believed fear was the only language the world respected. They watched Draven walk in without guards, cloak still damp, and they searched his face for weakness. He felt their thoughts like cold air. Why did you go alone? Why did you stoop? Why did you speak to villagers? Why did you send grain? They did not ask these questions aloud at first. The court had rules, and one rule was to test a king by pretending not to. Draven sat on his throne, but he did not look comfortable there. He looked like someone who had begun to realize a throne could be a cage, too. His steward, loyal, nervous, honest, approached. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the council requests an audience." Draven nodded. "Let them come." They came in a line, each with a version of concern. One advisor spoke first, voice smooth as polished wood. "Your Majesty, word has reached us of your personal involvement at the border." Draven's eyes did not harden. That alone unsettled them. "Yes," he said. A noblewoman with rings on every finger tilted her head. "The villages are already whispering," she said. "They will assume they can appeal to your sentiment now." Draven's gaze met hers. "Then let them appeal," he replied. A captain stepped forward, jaw tight. "Mercy will be mistaken for weakness," he said. "The southern factions will test us. The border will become restless." Draven listened. He did not interrupt. He did not threaten. When the captain finished, Draven spoke quietly. "They have been testing us for years," Draven said. "Not because we were merciful, but because we were cruel. Cruelty teaches people to resist or submit. It does not teach loyalty." The room went still. The captain's voice rose. "Fear keeps order." Draven's expression tightened, not with rage, but with something like sadness. Fear keeps silence, he corrected. Order is something else. Order is what you build when people believe they will not be punished for being honest. Some of the nobles shifted. Honesty was dangerous. It always had been. It threatened the stories they told themselves about why the world had to be harsh. Another advisor cleared his throat. "And the traitor?" he asked carefully. "The one who fled, we were told you." Draven felt the old instinct to simplify, to end the conversation with a sharp answer, to say, "He is dead. It is done. Do not question me." He could do that. He had done it for centuries. But Elara's voice rose in his memory. "Don't make redemption about guilt. Make it about change." Draven's fingers tightened on the armrest. Then he released them. "He is not a traitor," Draven said. The court went silent like a held breath. Draven continued, words measured. "He refused an unjust order," he said. "The unjust order was mine. I will not execute conscience and call it loyalty." Murmurs broke out, shock, disbelief, anger. The noblewoman's eyes narrowed. "You would let defiance stand." Draven looked at her. "I would let integrity stand," he said. The captain took a step forward, voice sharp. "If others refuse orders—" "Then we will examine the orders," Draven replied. "Not crush the ones who refuse." The room felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if the rules had shifted under their feet. Some looked afraid. Some looked furious. A few quiet ones in the back looked relieved in ways they didn't dare show. Draven stood, not to loom, to end the meeting with clarity. "I am still your king," he said calmly. "I will still protect this realm. I will still enforce laws. But we will no longer confuse suffering with strength. We will no longer take from the hungry to prove we can." His steward blinked rapidly, as if trying not to cry. Draven's gaze swept the room. "If any among you believe the throne requires cruelty to remain stable," he said, "you are free to leave my service. I will not punish you for that either." No one moved. Pride held them in place, and fear, yes, fear, of what it meant to step away. But a different kind of fear now, fear of being seen for what they were if the king stopped performing the role they'd built their lives around. Draven dismissed them with a gesture. They filed out, tense and whispering. When the hall finally emptied, Draven stood alone in the quiet. The vastness of the castle pressed down around him. He realized how many of his decisions had been made to avoid loneliness, and how loneliness had come anyway. His steward approached carefully. "Your Majesty," he said, voice trembling, "they will fight you on this." Draven nodded. "I know." "And the other courts," the steward added. "They may." "Let them," Draven said softly. "I have spent too long living to avoid being challenged. Perhaps challenge is the price of becoming someone worth following." That night, Draven sat at a desk instead of on his throne. He wrote letters himself, no grand decrees, no flowery language. Plain acknowledgments, clear policies, names of villages, lists of repayments. Rules that protected the weak not as an act of charity, but as an act of justice. He found, to his surprise, that writing this way hurt. Each sentence forced him to see the human cost of what he had once signed with a careless hand. Before dawn, he sent a private message to Elara's village, not with orders, with a request. "Protect her," the letter said. "She did what was right. Do not make her pay for my past." He did not sign it as Draven, Vampire King. He signed it simply, Draven. Days passed, then weeks. The grain arrived, not spoiled, not delayed. The tax collectors came less often. Patrols stopped harassing farmers for sport. The village began to breathe slowly, as if learning again what it meant not to live under constant pressure. Elara watched it cautiously. She knew how easily power could change its mind. But each practical delivery, each quiet policy, made it harder to believe this was only a brief softness before another storm. Kale, whose real name Elara eventually learned was Soren, healed slowly. Not like a human, not like a storybook monster either, like someone whose body and soul had been strained in the same place for too long. He stayed in Elara's back room longer than he wanted to, partly because the road was dangerous, partly because he didn't know who he was now that he'd refused. Defiance is easier in the moment. Living afterward is harder. One evening, as Elara chopped herbs, Soren sat at her table, watching the flame in the hearth like it was teaching him something. "He changed," Soren said quietly, as if saying it too loudly might summon disappointment. Elara didn't look up. "He started," she corrected. "Changing is what happens next when everyone tries to pull him back." Soren's fingers traced the edge of the table. "Do you think he can?" he asked, voice raw. Elara paused her chopping. She thought of Draven's face in her doorway, the calm sorrow, the way he'd asked to come in. She thought of the village headman reading the letter with trembling hands. She thought of a king standing before his court and refusing to punish integrity. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think he wants to, and wanting to isn't enough. Still, it's where it begins." Soren's eyes lowered. "I used to believe he was incapable," he admitted. "Not evil exactly, just hollow, like a man who forgot he had choices." Elara set her knife down. "Maybe he did," she said. "Or maybe he believed he didn't deserve to choose anything good. Some people cling to cruelty because it feels like the only honest thing about them." Soren looked at her sharply. "And you?" he asked. "Why did you open your door?" Elara wiped her hands. "Because one day I might be the one knocking," she said. "And I don't want to live in a world where the answer is always no." Soren swallowed. "You could have died." Elara nodded. "Yes." "And you still would." Elara's throat tightened. "I don't want to be brave," she said. "I want to be decent. Brave is what you call decency when the world makes it dangerous." Soren stared at her for a long time. Then he looked away, eyes shining with a grief he couldn't name. Far away, in Draven's castle, decency continued to be dangerous. His nobles did test him. They brought him reports framed to provoke. They exaggerated border disputes, hoping he would respond with old brutality. They warned him of rebellion, hoping fear would make him reach for cruelty like a familiar tool. And each time, Draven chose differently. Not perfectly. Sometimes his temper flared. Sometimes he felt the old hunger for control rise in him like a reflex. But he began to recognize the moment before he acted, the moment where he could pause and ask himself, "Am I protecting my realm, or am I protecting my pride?" In those pauses, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was the slow work of becoming accountable. One night, a young messenger arrived from the border, trembling. He carried news of a small conflict. A patrol captain had tried to seize grain anyway, claiming Draven's order was misunderstood. The village resisted. No one died, but the fear returned like a sickness. Draven read the report, and the old part of him wanted to respond the old way. Punish the village for resistance, reward the captain for strength, prove the throne was still sharp. He sat with that urge until he could see it clearly for what it was, an addiction to being obeyed. Then he wrote 2 orders. The first removed the captain from duty and reassigned him to labor among the border villages for a season, not as humiliation, but as education. To carry sacks, to see faces, to learn the weight of what he took. The second sent a message to the village. You will not be punished for refusing injustice. You will be protected for it. His steward hesitated when he saw the orders. They will say you're undermining your own authority, he warned. Draven's voice was quiet. No, he said, I'm redefining it. Weeks later, Draven returned to Elara's village again, not with secrecy this time, but with intention. He came in daylight, with only his steward beside him and a single wagon of supplies behind. The villagers gathered in the muddy square, half curious, half terrified. Elara stood at the edge of the crowd, hands clasped tightly. She felt Soren behind her, hood up, face hidden. He had not wanted to come, but Elara had insisted. "If he's changing," she'd told him, "then you deserve to witness it, not for him, for you." Draven stepped into the square and let the villagers look at him. He did not demand bows. He did not punish the ones who refused to meet his eyes. Bram, the headman, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said stiffly. Draven nodded. "Bram," he replied, using the man's name. That alone sent a ripple through the crowd. Bram's hands were clenched at his sides. "Why are you here?" he asked. "To see if we're grateful." Draven's gaze softened. "No," he said. "Gratitude is not the point. I'm here to say something I should have said long ago." He turned slowly, letting all of them hear. "I ruled as if fear was the only thing that kept a realm together," Draven said. "I took from you because it was easy, because I could. I called it order. It was not order. It was hunger wearing a crown." The villagers stood stunned. Elara's breath caught. Draven continued, voice steady. "I cannot undo the seasons you suffered," he said, "but I can acknowledge them. I can repay what can be repaid, and I can change what happens next." A woman in the crowd, thin, weathered, spoke up, voice shaking. "Why?" she demanded. "Why now? What do you want from us?" Draven's eyes flicked to her and held. "I want you to live," he said simply. "Not just survive. Live with enough safety that your children do not learn fear as their first language." The woman's face crumpled. She turned away, wiping her eyes with her sleeve as if embarrassed by the softness of her own hope. Draven gestured to the wagon. "These supplies are yours," he said. "Not a gift, a repayment." He paused, then added, "And Elara opened her door to a wounded traveler. She did not betray you. She reminded me what decency looks like. If any harm comes to her because of my past, it will be answered by me." Elara felt the villagers glance at her, some with surprise, some with dawning respect, some with guilt for their earlier suspicion. But no one spoke against her. Bram's shoulders dropped slightly as if a tight knot had finally loosened. After the crowd dispersed, Draven approached Elara's house again. This time he did not knock like a stranger. He knocked like someone acknowledging he had been inside before and had no right to pretend he wasn't changed by it. Elara opened the door and stood facing him, the smell of herbs and warm wood behind her. "You came back," she said. Draven nodded. "I needed to see if the words I spoke in my court could survive the eyes of the people who paid for them," he replied. Elara studied him. He looked the same and different at once. Still pale, still ancient, still carrying something cold beneath his skin. But his gaze was less guarded, like someone who had stopped pretending he was beyond consequence. "You're doing the right things," Elara said. "That doesn't mean people will trust you." "I don't expect trust," Draven answered. "Not yet, perhaps not ever, but I can live without being loved. I cannot live with being cruel." Behind Elara, Soren stepped forward into view. His hood fell back, revealing his face. Draven's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Soren," he said, using the true name like a balm. Soren's jaw tightened. "You told them I wasn't a traitor," he said. "I told the truth," Draven replied. Soren stared at him. "And what am I now?" Draven's expression turned quiet, thoughtful. "You are what you were all along," he said. "Someone who refused to let my hunger become your character." Soren's throat worked. "I lost everything," he whispered. "My place, my safety, my belief that following you meant something." Draven nodded once. "I know," he said, voice low. "And I am sorry, not the kind of sorry that wants to be forgiven, the kind that accepts it may never be." Elara felt the air between them tighten, not with romance, but with something rarer, accountability. Soren's hands clenched. "Then prove it," he said. "Not with grain, not with speeches. Prove it when your court threatens you. Prove it when the easy path returns." Draven held his gaze. "I will," he said. Soren looked away, breath trembling. "I want to believe you," he admitted, as if the wanting itself hurt. Draven's voice softened. "Then don't believe me yet," he said. "Watch me." That was the most honest offer a king could make. Not a promise of perfection, but permission to judge him by what he did next. Draven left Elara's home again, but this time the leaving did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something slow and difficult, the way true change always begins, without certainty, without applause, but with a choice made again and again. In the months that followed, the realm shifted in small, meaningful ways. Draven established new channels for border villages to send grievances without fear of punishment. He reduced the court's power to seize resources on impulse. He demanded that his captains learn the names of the people they protected, instead of speaking of them like burdens. The court resisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. Draven did not respond with cruelty. He responded with patience and firm boundaries, which for a vampire king was a kind of revolution. Not everyone approved. Some left. Some plotted. Draven endured the discomfort of being disliked without reaching for fear as a weapon. He learned that loneliness was not fatal, not even to an immortal. Elara remained in her village, tending herbs and neighbors, but her house became something else too. A reminder that history can shift not only through wars and crowns, but through ordinary people refusing to let fear make them smaller. Soren healed enough to travel again. He did not return to the court as a servant. He did not become a symbol Draven could display. He chose his own path, moving between villages to protect them from lesser predators, human bandits, desperate thieves, night creatures that were not kings and had no conscience. Sometimes he returned to Elara's home to rest. Sometimes he carried messages for Draven, not because he owed him loyalty, but because he wanted the new beginning to survive. And Draven, in his castle, began to notice the difference between being obeyed and being followed. One evening, nearly a year after the rainy night that started it all, Draven stood on his balcony and watched a mild spring rain fall over the dark forest. It touched the stone and stayed there, shimmering. The castle, for once, did not feel untouchable. His steward approached quietly. "A letter," he said, offering it. Draven broke the seal and read Elara's handwriting. Plain, careful, honest. "The village's harvest looks better this year," she wrote. "Not because the weather is kinder, but because we're not losing what we need to survive. People still speak of you with caution. That is fair. But children are laughing louder again. I thought you should know, not as praise, as consequence." Draven read it twice. Then he sat down, not because he was weak, but because the weight of the moment was too real to carry standing. Children laughing louder again. He had once believed a king's job was to be feared enough that no one challenged him. Now he understood that a king's job, if it meant anything at all, was to create a world where the gentle parts of life could exist without apology. He thought of Elara opening her door to a wounded man she didn't understand, simply because he asked and he was bleeding. He thought of Soren refusing an unjust order and paying for it with exile. He thought of the way he, Draven, had come to that small house expecting to settle a problem and instead found himself unsettled, in the best way. Draven looked out at the rain and let himself feel the regret fully, without turning it into self-pity, without using it as a performance. Regret, he was learning, was only useful when it became responsibility. He whispered into the quiet, as if speaking to the night itself. "Thank you," he said, whether to Elara, to Soren, or to the version of himself that had finally chosen to change, he wasn't sure. perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere, in a small village at the edge of his realm, a lamp still burned by a door. Not as a lure, not as a challenge, but as a promise. That mercy, when offered without conditions, could travel farther than fear ever did. And Draven, vampire king, ancient and imperfect, understood at last that his redemption would not arrive as a sudden purity. It would arrive as a daily discipline, to choose restraint when cruelty felt convenient, to choose repayment when taking felt easy, to choose humanity even when he could have hidden behind his monsterhood. Because he had learned the deepest truth of all, from a woman with herbs on her rafters and courage in her ordinary hands. A door is not only something that keeps danger out. Sometimes it is the one thing that lets a lost soul come back in.